No woman should ever be wagered like cattle in a poker game. But that's exactly what happened to Lily Rae on a stormy night in the New Mexico territory. Her father, broke and desperate, bet his own daughter's hand in marriage to a stranger named Wade Cutter. Wade won the hand, thinking it was all a bluff. But when Lily showed up at his door the next morning, with her bags packed and her chin held high, everything changed. She wasn't broken. She was determined to make her own way. Wade gave her his house, his name, and tried to keep his distance. But could a marriage that started with a card game ever become something real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wade Cutter had built his life on certainty. Every fence post on his ranch stood exactly where he'd placed it. Every horse in his corral knew his voice. Every sunrise found him at the same kitchen table, drinking coffee black as midnight and planning his day with the precision of a man who'd learned that control meant survival. The homestead deed hanging on his wall bore his name alone, Wade Samuel Cutter, written in the careful script of a territorial clerk who'd witnessed plenty of men stake their claims on this harsh land. Most failed. Wade had not. For 12 years, he'd carved prosperity from the red dirt and stubborn sage of the New Mexico territory, building something solid where others saw only emptiness. His reputation stretched from Las Cruces to Santa Fe. Fair in his dealings, hard in his work, and faster with iron than most men were with words. At 34, he'd earned the respect that came with keeping your word and minding your own business. Women in town looked his way with interest, but Wade had never felt the pull toward marriage that seemed to drive other men toward foolish choices. Until last night. The storm had been biblical in its fury, turning the dusty streets of Mesilla into rivers of mud and driving every soul with sense indoors. The Silverado saloon had been packed with men waiting out the tempest, and the poker game that started friendly had turned serious when the stakes climbed higher than a cowhand's monthly wages. Wade remembered the exact moment everything changed. Thomas Brennan, a drifter who'd been losing steadily all evening, had sat across from him with wild eyes and empty pockets. The man's desperation had been palpable, seeping through the tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes like the scent of fear itself. "I ain't got coin left," Brennan had said, his voice cracking like old leather. "But I got something worth more than money." The saloon had fallen quiet except for the drumming of rain against the windows. Even the piano player had stopped his tinkling to listen. "My daughter," Brennan had continued, his words barely above a whisper. "Lily Rae, prettiest girl in 3 territories. I'll wager her hand in marriage." The silence that followed had been deafening. Men had wagered land, livestock, even their guns in desperate moments, but never a human soul. Wade had felt the weight of every eye in the room, waiting to see what he'd do. He should have walked away, should have told Brennan to sober up and find his way home, should have done anything except what he did. Instead, he'd looked at his cards 3 queens and a pair of 8s and called the bet. Brennan had laid down his hand with shaking fingers, a pair of 7s, and nothing else. Wade had won. Now, standing in his kitchen as the morning sun painted the mountains gold, Wade stared at the woman who'd appeared at his door like a ghost made flesh. Lily Rae Brennan was nothing like he'd expected. She wasn't broken or weeping or cursing his name. She stood straight as a fence post, her brown eyes level with his, a carpet bag in one hand and something that might have been dignity in the set of her shoulders. "Mr. Cutter," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I believe we have some business to discuss." She was beautiful, he had to admit, not in the painted, perfumed way of saloon girls, but in the clean, honest way of morning light on water. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was all angles and determination. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but was clean and mended with care. "Miss Brennan," Wade said, removing his hat, "I reckon we do." He'd offered her breakfast first, thinking she might be hungry after traveling since dawn. She'd accepted coffee but declined food, sitting across from him at the table where he'd eaten alone for so many years. The silence between them had stretched like a rope drawn tight, filled with questions neither seemed ready to ask. "I want you to know," Lily said finally, "that I don't hold you responsible for my father's actions. A man's debts are his own burden." Wade studied her face, looking for signs of the fear she had to be feeling. "You didn't have to come here." "Yes, I did." Her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "My father may be a fool, but he's not a liar. He made a wager, and you won fairly. I honor my family's obligations, even when I don't agree with them." The words hit Wade like a physical blow. He'd spent the sleepless night hoping she wouldn't come, that the whole thing had been a bad dream brought on by whiskey and stormlight. But here she was, treating his accidental acquisition of a wife like a business transaction. "I didn't know he was serious," Wade said. "Thought he was bluffing." "He wasn't." Lily's voice carried a weariness that seemed too old for her face. "My father doesn't bluff. He gambles, and he loses, and he expects others to pay the price for his weakness." Wade stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over his land. Cattle dotted the pasture like scattered stones, and his horses moved with the lazy contentment of animals well tended. It was a good life, a simple life, and now it was complicated by a woman who should have been a stranger. "I can't keep you here against your will," he said without turning around. "You're not keeping me anywhere, Mr. Cutter. I'm choosing to stay." The words stopped him cold. He turned to face her, searching her expression for understanding. "Why?" Lily Rae set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to break things she couldn't replace. "Because I have nowhere else to go. Because my father's gambling debts have made me unmarriageable to any decent man in our county. Because for the first time in my life, I have the chance to build something that belongs to me." She stood then, smoothing her skirt with hands that shook only slightly. "I won't be a burden to you, Mr. Cutter. I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a household. I can read and write and cipher numbers. I know something about medicine and more about making do with less than you'd think possible." Wade felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. "And what do you expect from me?" "Respect," she said simply. "A roof over my head and food on the table. Protection from men who would use me poorly. In exchange, I'll be a proper wife in name and deed, though I understand if you don't want more than that." The last words hung in the air between them like smoke from a doused fire. Wade realized she was offering him an arrangement, not a marriage. A business partnership dressed up in legal vows. "There's a spare room upstairs," he heard himself say. "You can have that. I'll sleep down here until we figure out what we're doing." Something flickered in her eyes, relief maybe, or disappointment. He couldn't tell which. "Thank you," she said. "That's more kindness than I expected." Wade watched her gather her belongings, noting the way she moved with economy and grace. Everything about her spoke of someone who'd learned to make the best of difficult circumstances. He wondered what her life had been like before this moment, what dreams she'd carried that were now reduced to accepting marriage to a stranger. "One more thing," he said as she reached the stairs. "What you said about being a proper wife, I won't force anything on you. When something happens between us, if it happens, it'll be because we both want it." She paused on the bottom step, her back to him. "I appreciate that, Mr. Cutter. Not all men would be so considerate." "Call me Wade," he said. "If we're going to be married, we might as well use names." "Wade," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "And I'm Lily, just Lily." He listened to her footsteps on the stairs, the creak of floorboards overhead, the sound of a door closing gently. Then he was alone again in his kitchen, staring at 2 coffee cups and wondering how a single hand of poker had changed everything he thought he knew about his life. Outside, his foreman Miguel was calling to the hands about moving the cattle to the north pasture. Life on the ranch continued its familiar rhythm, but Wade knew that rhythm had already been broken. Nothing would be the same now. The question was whether what came next would be better or worse than the solitude he'd treasured. He thought about the deed on his wall, his name written in solitary authority. Soon, he realized, there might be another name beside it. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, It filled him with something he didn't quite recognize, something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 weeks passed like a careful dance between strangers. Lily moved through Wade's house with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful without making herself noticed. She cooked meals that appeared on the table precisely when Wade returned from his work, cleaned without disturbing his routines, and mended his clothes with stitches so fine they seemed to heal rather than repair. Wade, for his part, tried to give her space while wrestling with the growing awareness that his house had become something different, warmer somehow, filled with small touches that spoke of a woman's presence. Fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table, curtains that had been washed and pressed until they caught the morning light just so. The scent of bread baking that made him hurry home, like a man with something to look forward to. They spoke politely about practical matters, the weather, the state of the cattle, whether she needed anything from town. But underneath the careful courtesy lay a tension. Neither acknowledged the question of what they were becoming to each other. Lily kept her mother's wedding ring tucked away in a small wooden box beside her bed. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would hold it up to catch the early light streaming through her window. The simple gold band represented everything she dreamed marriage could be: love freely given, promises made in joy rather than desperation, a partnership built on choice rather than circumstance. Her mother had worn it for 18 years before fever took her, and even in delirium, she'd whispered stories of the day her father had proposed beneath a cottonwood tree, how they'd planned their future together like architects, drawing blueprints for happiness. That ring was proof that love could exist, even if Lily had never seen it in her own father's eyes after her mother's death. Now, as she prepared breakfast in Wade's kitchen, she wondered if she'd ever have reason to wear it. The man she'd married was kind but distant, respectful but careful never to touch her, even accidentally. She understood his caution, perhaps even appreciated it, but part of her wondered if he saw her as anything more than an obligation he'd inherited through an unlucky card game. The knock on the door came as she was setting Wade's coffee on the table. Sharp, insistent raps that spoke of authority and bad news. Wade, who'd been reading a week-old newspaper, looked up with the alertness of a man who'd learned to recognize trouble by its sound. "You expecting anyone?" he asked, already reaching for the gun belt he kept hanging by the door. Lily shook her head, but something cold settled in her stomach. She'd been dreading this moment for 3 weeks, hoping her father's debts had been forgotten or forgiven, knowing they hadn't. Wade opened the door to find Sheriff Coleman standing on the porch, his badge catching the morning sun. Behind him stood 2 men Lily recognized, with growing dread: Marcus Webb, who held the deed to half the gambling debts in 3 counties, and beside him, a stranger with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone who collected on those debts through methods the law preferred not to examine too closely. "Morning, Wade," Sheriff Coleman said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to bother you so early, but we got some business to discuss regarding your missus." Wade's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his gun. "What kind of business?" Marcus Webb stepped forward, his smile as thin as paper and twice as sharp. "The kind that involves money owed and promises made, Mr. Cutter. You see, Thomas Brennan wasn't entirely honest about his circumstances when he made that particular wager." Lily appeared behind Wade, and Webb's smile widened when he saw her. "There she is, Miss Lily Rae, looking as lovely as ever, though I suppose it's Mrs. Cutter now, isn't it?" "What do you want, Webb?" Wade's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made smart men reconsider their words. "Just what's rightfully owed," Webb replied, producing a folded paper from his vest. "You see, Brennan's debt to me is considerably larger than what he wagered that night. And since he used his daughter as collateral without my permission, I'm afraid that marriage of yours might not be as binding as you think." The words hit the morning air like stones thrown into still water. Lily felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the document. Webb held her father's promissory note, the one that had sent him fleeing toward the poker table in desperate hope of a miracle. "Explain yourself," Wade said, his voice deadly calm. Webb unfolded the paper with theatrical precision. Thomas Brennan owes me $800 plus interest. When he couldn't pay, he signed this note, putting up his daughter's hand in marriage as security. That was 6 months ago, Mr. Cutter, long before your little poker game. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. The law's a bit unclear on matters like this, Wade. But if Brennan already promised the girl to settle a debt— The law's perfectly clear, the stranger beside Webb interrupted, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A man can't wager what he doesn't own. Brennan forfeited his paternal rights when he defaulted on his debt to Mr. Webb. Lily stepped forward, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. And what exactly are you proposing to do about it? Webb's eyes glittered with something that made Wade's jaw clench. Why, collect what's owed, of course. You'll come with us now, and we'll see about arranging a more suitable marriage, one that properly settles your father's obligations. Like hell she will, Wade said, stepping protectively in front of Lily. Now, Wade, Sheriff Coleman said nervously, let's not make this harder than it has to be. The law says a woman can't be sold like livestock. Wade cut him off. Not in this territory, not anywhere decent men hold sway. Webb laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Decent men, Mr. Cutter? Is that what you call winning a woman in a poker game? At least I'm honest about what this is a business transaction. Wade's hand moved to his gun, but the stranger was faster, his own weapon appearing with practiced speed. I wouldn't, the man said mildly. Mr. Webb has legal papers. You have nothing but a gambling debt and delusions of chivalry. For a moment, the morning balanced on a knife's edge. Lily could feel Wade's tension like heat radiating from a forge, could see the calculations running behind his eyes as he measured odds and consequences. She knew he was fast with a gun. His reputation preceded him, but not fast enough to beat 3 men, especially with the law's questionable protection. There's another way, she said quietly, the words emerging before she could stop them. All eyes turned to her. Wade's expression was one of sharp concern, as if he could read the dangerous thoughts forming in her mind. I'll go with them, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But I want time to pack my things, and I want to speak with my husband alone. Webb considered this, glancing at his companion, who nodded slightly. 10 minutes, he said. Then we leave. The men stepped back from the porch, though they remained watchful. Wade guided Lily inside, closing the door with careful restraint when she knew he wanted to slam it. You're not going anywhere with them, he said immediately. Wade, listen to me. No, his voice brooked no argument. I don't care what papers they have or what laws they're twisting. You're my wife, and you're staying here. The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow, not because of the possessiveness she'd expected that, but because of the conviction behind it. Wade Cutter, who'd never asked for a wife, was prepared to fight for one. They'll kill you, she said simply. Webb doesn't make threats he won't carry out. And that man with him, I've heard stories about what he does to people who cross his employers. Then we'll leave, Wade said. Pack what you need. We'll be in Colorado before they know we're gone. Lily shook her head, tears threatening for the first time since this nightmare began. And live like fugitives, always looking over our shoulders? Wade, I won't let you throw away everything you've built for a marriage that started as a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he softened his voice. Maybe it didn't start the way it should have, but what we're building here, that's real, that's worth fighting for. She stared at him, seeing something in his eyes she'd only dared hope for. But before she could respond, Webb's voice called from outside. Time's up, folks. Let's make this easy on everyone. Wade's hand went to his gun again, but Lily caught his wrist. Promise me something, she said urgently. If I go with them now, promise me you'll find another way. A legal way. Don't throw your life away on a gunfight. You can't win. Lily, promise me. He looked into her eyes, saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide, and felt something shift inside his chest, like a lock finding its key. I promise, he said. But this isn't over. Whatever papers they have, whatever they think they can do, this isn't over. She nodded, rising on her toes to press a quick, desperate kiss to his cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I believe in you, Wade Cutter." Then she was gone, walking out to face whatever waited beyond his door, leaving Wade standing in his kitchen with the taste of possibility and the bitter knowledge that some battles couldn't be won with guns alone. Wade spent the first day after Lily's departure like a caged wolf, pacing his house and cursing his helplessness. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow. Every room held traces of her presence. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the bread she'd baked that morning. Her coffee cup sat unwashed in the sink, and upstairs, her door stood open to reveal the neat simplicity of her few possessions. On the second day, he rode to town with a purpose that burned in his chest like swallowed fire. If Webb thought legal papers gave him the right to traffic in human souls, then Wade would fight him with the same weapons. He spent the morning with Judge Harrison, a man whose integrity had survived 30 years on the territorial bench, learning exactly what rights he had as Lily's husband and what loopholes Webb might be exploiting. The news wasn't encouraging. Territorial law remained murky on such matters, and Webb's promissory notif legitimate predated the poker game by months. Still, Judge Harrison promised to examine the documents and see what challenges might be mounted in court. "These things take time, Wade," the old judge cautioned. "Weeks, maybe months. You prepared for a long fight?" Wade thought of Lily's face as she'd walked away with Webb's men, the quiet courage in her shoulders and the fear she'd tried so hard to hide. "However long it takes." It was on the third day that Miguel found him standing in the kitchen, staring at the recipe book Lily had left behind. The leather-bound volume lay open on the counter where she'd been planning the week's meals, her mother's handwriting flowing across pages yellowed with age and use. "Patron," Miguel said gently, using the title of respect he'd employed for 12 years. "The men, they are asking questions." Wade looked up from the page, detailing instructions for making cornbread, the way Lily's grandmother had taught her mother, the way her mother had taught her. Each recipe was more than food, it was family history written in measurements and memories. "What kind of questions?" Miguel removed his hat, turning it in his weathered hands. "They want to know if we fight or if we run. Word is spreading about what happened. Some say you should let the woman go, that she brings nothing but trouble. Others," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "others say a man who won't fight for his wife is no man at all." Wade closed the recipe book, his fingers tracing the worn cover. Inside these pages, Lily's mother had written notes in the margins, reminders about which spices her husband preferred. Modifications for high-altitude cooking, little love letters disguised as culinary instruction. It was a record of a marriage built on daily kindnesses, the kind of partnership Wade had never imagined possible until Lily had walked into his life. "What do you think, Miguel?" The foreman was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Wade's face. "I think," he said finally, "that in 12 years I have never seen you smile at your coffee cup. But these past weeks, you smiled every morning." Wade felt something twist in his chest. "She's only been here 3 weeks. See, but sometimes 3 weeks is enough to know." Miguel replaced his hat, settling it with the precision of a man preparing for serious business. "My Maria, she says the Senora has kind eyes. Says a woman with kind eyes and steady hands makes a good wife, no matter how the marriage began." "And what does Maria suggest I do about Webb?" Miguel's smile was sharp as a blade. "She suggests you remind him that this is your land, and men who steal from their neighbors sometimes have accidents in country this rough." Wade shook his head. "I gave her my word. I'd find a legal way." "Then we find a legal way that has teeth," Miguel said. "But Patron, if the legal way fails, my Maria also says that some promises are made to be broken when keeping them means losing what matters most." That evening, Wade sat at his kitchen table with Lily's recipe book open before him, trying to decipher her mother's instructions for making the cornbread Lily had served him every morning. The measurement seemed straightforward enough, But there were subtleties in the margin shints, about testing the oil temperature and adjusting for the dry mountain air that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. His first attempt was a disaster. The bread emerged from the oven, burned on the outside and raw in the center, a monument to his domestic incompetence. His second try was better, but still fell short of the golden perfection Lily had achieved effortlessly. It was past midnight when he finally produced something edible, though it lacked the light texture and subtle sweetness that had made Lily's version a daily pleasure. As he sat eating the imperfect cornbread with butter and honey, Wade realized what he was really trying to do, create not just her cooking, but the sense of home she'd brought to his solitary existence. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Judge Harrison arrived with his clerk, both men wearing the grim expressions of bearers of bad news. "The documents are real," Harrison said without preamble, settling his considerable bulk into one of Wade's kitchen chairs. "Webb's promissory note is properly witnessed and filed with the territorial registry. Brennan did indeed put up his daughter as security for the debt." Wade poured coffee with hands that remained steady despite the anger building in his chest. "So Webb has the legal right to claim her?" "Not exactly." Harrison accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the strong aroma. "The law is complex in these matters. A father's right to arrange his daughter's marriage is well established, but so is a husband's right to his wife. The question becomes, which contract takes precedence, Webb's note or your marriage certificate? And that depends on several factors. The validity of the original debt, the circumstances of the poker game, whether proper consent was given for the marriage." Harrison paused, studying Wade's face. "Most importantly, it depends on what the lady herself wants. A woman who refuses to honor a contract made without her consent has legal standing to challenge it." Wade felt a flutter of hope. "So if Lily testifies that she chooses to remain my wife—" "If she's allowed to testify," the clerk interrupted. "Webb has taken her to his ranch outside of Las Cruces. He's not likely to let her appear in court if he thinks she'll contradict his claims." "Then we go get her," Wade said simply. Harrison shook his head. "That would be kidnapping, legally speaking. You'd be taking her from the custody of a man with proper documentation of his claim. So what do you suggest?" The judge was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if seeking answers in its dark depths. "File a formal challenge to Webb's claim. Demand a hearing. Force him to bring her to court and let her speak for herself." "How long?" 6 weeks, minimum. Maybe longer if Webb's lawyers find ways to delay." 6 weeks. Wade thought of Lily in Webb's custody, subject to whatever pressure or coercion he might apply to secure her cooperation. 6 weeks of not knowing if she was safe, if she was being treated with the respect she deserved, if she would even want to return to a marriage that had brought her nothing but trouble. "There's something else," Harrison added reluctantly. "Word is that Webb has already arranged another marriage for her, some cattle baron from Texas who's willing to pay handsomely for a young, educated wife." Wade's cup hit the table harder than he'd intended, coffee sloshing over the rim. "When?" "Soon, maybe within the month. If she's married to another man before we can get her into court." "Then we make sure that doesn't happen," Wade said, his voice carrying a finality that made both men look at him sharply. Harrison leaned forward. "Wade, I understand your feelings, but you can't take the law into your own hands, not if you want any chance of winning this legally." Wade looked at the recipe book still lying open on his table, at the careful notations of a woman who'd spent her life creating sustenance and comfort for the people she loved. Lily had left it behind, perhaps hoping he'd understand the message hidden in its pages that some things were worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything a man had built. "Judge," he said quietly, "some fights can't be won in courtrooms." The days stretched like pulled wire, each one bringing Wade closer to the edge of his carefully maintained composure. He threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that worried his men, riding fence lines until dark and rising before dawn to tackle repairs that could have waited for better weather. Physical exhaustion was the only thing that quieted the restless energy that threatened to drive him toward rash action. It was during one of these long days, while replacing rotted posts along the northern boundary, that Miguel approached with the careful manner of a man bearing delicate news. "There is talk in town," Miguel said, working alongside Wade to set a new post. "About the Senora." Wade's hammer struck the post driver harder than necessary. "What kind of talk?" "The priest, Father Morales, says Webb brought him documents. Asked him to perform a marriage ceremony within the month." The hammer slipped, barely missing Wade's thumb. He set the tool down carefully, his knuckles white against the wooden handle. "And? Father Morales, he is a wise man. He told Webb that before he could perform such a ceremony, he would need to speak with the bride privately, to ensure she enters the marriage of her own free will." A spark of hope flickered in Wade's chest. Father Morales had been in the territory for 20 years, long enough to know the difference between a willing bride and a coerced one. Did Webb agree? Miguel's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. He had little choice. To refuse would raise questions about the legitimacy of his claim. But the padre, he is clever. He insisted the conversation must take place in the church, without Webb or his men present. When? This Sunday, after morning mass. Wade straightened, his mind already working through possibilities. Sunday was 3 days away. 3 days to plan, to consider options, to decide whether his promise to Lily outweighed his need to know she was safe. That evening, as he sat alone in his kitchen with another failed attempt at Lily's cornbread, Wade found himself reaching for the pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The heavy gold timepiece bore the scratches and dents of a working man's life, and inside the cover, his father's initials were engraved alongside the date of his marriage to Wade's mother. Samuel Cutter had been a hard man shaped by hard times, but he'd possessed an unshakable belief in doing what was right, regardless of the cost. He died when Wade was 16, gored by a bull he'd been trying to save from a flash flood, and his last words had been about protecting what mattered most. "A man's word is his bond," Samuel had gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "But sometimes, son, you got to choose which word matters more." Wade had carried those words for 18 years, never quite understanding what his father meant until now. He'd given Lily his promise to fight legally, but he'd also made other promises to protect her, to honor their marriage, to be worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking time that seemed to move both too fast and too slow. Sunday would bring answers, but it might also bring a final chance to act before Lily was lost to him forever. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah Martinez, the blacksmith's wife, and one of the few women in town bold enough to speak her mind to men who preferred their silence, appeared at Wade's door with a basket covered in gingham cloth. "Mr. Cutter," she said, her no-nonsense manner cutting through any pleasantries. "I've brought you some proper food before you waste away to nothing." Wade accepted the basket gratefully, inhaling the scent of real bread and what smelled like Maria's famous stew. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Martinez. Kindness has nothing to do with it," Sarah replied, settling herself uninvited at his kitchen table. "I'm here because the women in town have been talking, and we've reached some conclusions about your situation." Wade poured coffee for both of them, recognizing the tone of a woman who had things to say whether he wanted to hear them or not. "What kind of conclusions?" "The kind that involve Marcus Webb being a snake who's gotten too comfortable thinking decent folks will stand by while he treats women like livestock." Sarah's dark eyes flashed with an anger that made Wade sit up. "Straighter. That girl of yours, Lily, she helped birth my youngest when the midwife couldn't get through a storm. Worked all night, she did, gentle as an angel and steady as a rock." Wade felt something tight in his chest, loosened slightly. "I didn't know." "Course you didn't. Men never know the half of what women do for each other." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But here's what you need to know. Father Morales isn't the only one who'll be at the church Sunday. There's a whole congregation of folks who remember kindness when they see it." "Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate." "You appreciate nothing yet," she interrupted. But you will, because we've also been talking to Judge Harrison's wife, and she's been talking to the judge. And it seems there might be some irregularities in Webb's paperwork that a careful examination might reveal. Wade stared at her, hardly daring to hope. What kind of irregularities? Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that happen when a man's too eager to make his documents look legitimate. Dates that don't quite match up. Witnesses who might not have been where they claimed to be. Small things, but enough to raise questions about whether Webb's note is as ironclad as he pretends. How do you know all this? Because Mrs. Harrison's sister works for the Territorial Registry, and she remembers when Webb filed his papers. Remembers thinking it was strange that a gambling debt would be so formally documented, especially when the witness signatures looked suspiciously similar. Wade felt the first real hope he'd experienced in days. You're saying the documents might be forged. I'm saying they're worth a closer look by someone who knows what to look for. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirts with the satisfaction of a woman who'd delivered important news. Which brings me to why I'm really here. She reached into her basket and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Wade saw a small derringer, nickel-plated and elegant, despite its deadly purpose. This belonged to my grandmother, Sarah said. She carried it during the Apache troubles, said a lady should always have a final option if men failed to protect her properly. Wade stared at the weapon, understanding flooding through him. You want me to give this to Lily? I want you to make sure she has choices, Sarah corrected. Because if Webb's documents are fake, and if Father Morales can get her to speak freely, and if the law decides to move faster than usual, well, a woman should be prepared for any possibility. Wade took the derringer, feeling its weight in his palm. It was a gamble within a gamble, a backup plan for a backup plan. But it was also something more proof that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Sunday, he said, more to himself than to Sarah. Sunday, she agreed. And Mr. Cutter? That girl of yours, she's stronger than you think. Don't underestimate what she might do when she knows she has people fighting for her. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, Wade remained seated at his table, his father's watch in one hand and Sarah's grandmother's gun in the other. Two inheritances, two philosophies, two paths forward. Time would tell which one would matter more. But for the first time since Lily had been taken, Wade felt like he was playing a hand he might actually win. Sunday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Wade dressed with the careful attention of a man preparing for battle, choosing his best shirt and checking his gun twice before sliding it into its holster. The small derringer from Sarah Martinez rested in his vest pocket, a secret weight against his ribs. The church bells of San Miguel were ringing as Wade reached the edge of town, their bronze voices carrying across the valley like a call to arms. He'd timed his arrival carefully late enough to avoid drawing attention, early enough to secure a position where he could observe without being seen. Father Morales conducted the morning service with his usual dignified solemnity, but Wade could see the tension in the priest's shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally moved to the back pews where Webb sat with two of his men. There was no sign of Lily, and Wade felt his chest tighten with each passing minute. As the congregation filed out after the final blessing, Wade positioned himself behind the general store where he could watch the church entrance. Most of the townspeople lingered in the morning sun, exchanging pleasantries and gossip, but Webb's men remained conspicuously alert, their hands never far from their weapons. It was nearly 10 minutes before Webb emerged from the church, followed by Father Morales, and then Wade's breath caught Lily herself. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders drawn inward and her head slightly bowed, but she was walking under her own power and showed no obvious signs of mistreatment. She wore a dress Wade had never seen before, something in pale yellow that seemed to wash the color from her face, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that didn't suit her natural grace. Webb gestured toward a covered buggy waiting at the church steps, but Father Morales intercepted him with a raised hand. Wade couldn't hear the words, but the priest's body language was unmistakable. He was insisting on his promised private conversation with Lily. For a moment, it looked like Webb might refuse. His face darkened with anger, and one of his men stepped forward threateningly. But then Sarah Martinez appeared from the church, followed by Judge Harrison's wife and several other prominent women of the town. Their presence created a buffer around Father Morales and Lily, a silent wall of respectability that Webb couldn't easily push through without causing a scene. Wade watched as Lily was escorted back into the church, her movements careful and controlled. Webb remained outside with his men, pacing like a caged animal while the minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then longer. Inside the church, away from Wade's sight, Lily sat in the front pew facing Father Morales. The priest's kind eyes studied her face with the gentle concern of someone who'd spent decades listening to confessions and offering comfort to troubled souls. "My child," he said softly, "I must ask you some difficult questions. Please know that whatever you tell me here remains between us and God." Lily nodded, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "I understand, Father. Mr. Webb claims you are promised to another man, that your marriage to Mr. Cutter was invalid. Is this true?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Lily thought of Wade's kitchen, of the quiet mornings they'd shared, of the way he'd looked at her before Webb's men had taken her away. She thought of the embroidered handkerchief she'd sewn during their brief weeks together, how Wade had picked it up from the table where she'd left it and tucked it into his shirt pocket without saying a word. "No, Father," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My marriage to Wade Cutter is real and valid. Whatever promises my father made, he made them without my knowledge or consent." Father Morales leaned forward slightly. "And do you wish to remain married to Mr. Cutter?" This was the question that mattered, the one that would determine everything that followed. Lily closed her eyes, remembering Wade's promise that anything between them would happen only if they both wanted it, the respect he'd shown her from the first moment, the way he'd been willing to fight legal battles rather than simply take what he could have claimed by right. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Father. I choose my husband. I choose Wade." Outside, Webb's patience had reached its limit. He strode toward the church doors, but found his way blocked by Sarah Martinez and her formidable companions. "The Padre said private conversation," Sarah stated firmly. "That means you wait out here like the rest of us." "That woman is my property by legal right," Webb snarled, his careful facade finally slipping. "I don't need some Mexican priest's permission to—" He never finished the sentence. Judge Harrison, who'd been approaching from across the square, had heard enough. "Did you just refer to a human being as your property, Mr. Webb?" Webb spun around, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "Your Honor, I was simply revealing your true nature," Harrison interrupted, his judicial demeanor arctic with disapproval. "I suggest you choose your words more carefully, especially when discussing matters that may soon come before my court." The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment, the church doors opened and Father Morales emerged with Lily at his side. The priest's expression was serene, but there was steel in his voice when he spoke. "I have completed my interview with Mrs. Cutter," he announced, emphasizing her married name. "She has informed me that she entered her current marriage freely and wishes to remain in it. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience perform any ceremony that would violate the sanctity of her existing union." Webb's face went white with rage. "You have no authority." "I have the authority of the Church and the law of God," Father Morales replied calmly, "and both are quite clear on the matter of a woman's right to choose her own path." From his hiding place, Wade felt a surge of pride and relief, so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees. Lily had chosen him. Despite everything, the circumstances of their marriage, the danger Webb represented, the uncertain future they faced, she had chosen him. But even as hope flared in his chest, Wade could see that Webb wasn't finished. The man's eyes held a dangerous glitter, and his hand had moved to rest on his gun butt. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Webb stepped closer to Lily, his voice dropping to a tone that carried across the churchyard like a threat. "This isn't finished, girl. Legal or not, you're coming with me. Today." That's when Lily surprised everyone, including Wade. She reached into her sleeve and withdrew something small and silver that caught the morning light, a sewing needle, sharp as a blade and wielded with the precision of someone who'd spent years working with delicate fabrics. "Touch me," she said quietly, "and you'll regret it." The needle might have been tiny, but the threat was real enough to make Webb step back. Around the churchyard, conversations had stopped as people turned to watch the drama unfolding. Wade felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun, but forced himself to remain still. This was Lily's moment, her chance to show the town and herself exactly who she was. "You can't hide behind these people forever," Webb said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Lily lifted her chin, and Wade saw in her face the same determination that had carried her to his door 3 weeks ago. "I'm not hiding, Mr. Webb. I'm choosing. And I choose my husband, my home, and my freedom, in that order." The words rang across the churchyard like a bell, clear and true and uncompromising. Wade felt something shift in his chest, a certainty that had nothing to do with legal documents or territorial law. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The tension that followed Lily's declaration stretched like a wire about to snap. Webb's men had moved closer, their hands resting openly on their weapons, while the townspeople formed a protective circle around Lily and Father Morales. Wade remained hidden, every instinct screaming at him to step forward, but knowing that revealing himself too soon might escalate the situation beyond anyone's control. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the charged air with judicial authority. "Mr. Webb, I believe this matter would be better resolved in a courtroom than on church grounds." Webb's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Courts take time, Your Honor, time I don't have." He gestured to his men, who began moving toward Lily with purposeful steps. "I'm taking what belongs to me, today." That's when Wade stepped out from behind the general store, his boot heels striking the packed earth with deliberate rhythm. Every eye turned toward him as he walked across the square, his hand loose and ready at his side, his gaze fixed on Webb with laser intensity. "The lady said no," Wade said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Where I come from, that ends the discussion." Webb's face twisted with a mixture of surprise and rage. "Cutter, I was wondering when you'd show yourself." "I'm here now." Wade stopped about 20 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to have room to move if shooting started. "And I'm here to take my wife home." For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Webb's gunmen were professionals. Wade could see that in their stance, and the way they watched him, without seeming to. But they were also outnumbered by townspeople who'd grown tired of being intimidated by outside threats. "Your wife?" Webb sneered. "Based on what? A poker game? You think winning a hand of cards gives you the right to steal another man's property?" "I think," Wade said evenly, "that calling any woman property is going to get you shot. And I think you know it." Sarah Martinez stepped forward from the crowd, her voice ringing with maternal authority. "Marcus Webb, your mother would be ashamed to hear you talk that way about any decent woman." Other voices joined herdsmen and women who'd watched Webb's arrogance grow for months, who'd seen him intimidate honest folks with legal papers and hired guns. The crowd's mood was shifting, and Webb could feel it like a change in weather. "This isn't over," Webb said, but he was already backing toward his buggy. "Legal papers, trump frontier justice, Cutter. I'll be back with a federal marshal." "You do that," Wade replied, "but you come back to my land again without proper authority, and we'll settle this the old way." Webb climbed into his buggy with as much dignity as he could muster, his men following with obvious reluctance. As the wheels began to turn, he leaned out to deliver one final threat. "Enjoy your stolen bride while you can, Cutter. Some debts come due whether you want them to or not." The buggy disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving the townspeople standing in uncomfortable silence. Wade felt the collective attention shift to him and Lily, who remained by the church steps with Father Morales. She was looking at him now, her brown eyes wide with something that might have been relief or surprise or something deeper. Wade crossed the remaining distance between them, acutely aware of every watching face, every whispered comment. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Lily nodded, though he could see the fine tremor in her hands. I knew you'd come. I gave you my word I'd find a legal way. And you did. Father Morales, Judge Harrison, all these people that's legal enough for me. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. Besides, I had this. She showed him the sewing needle still concealed in her palm, and Wade felt something that was half admiration, half terror. His wife and the word felt real now, in a way it never had before, was braver than he'd given her credit for. We should get you home, he said. Yes, she agreed. Home. The word carried weight between them, an acknowledgement that whatever had started as arrangement had become something else entirely. Wade offered his arm, and Lily took it with the natural grace of a woman accepting her rightful place at her husband's side. As they walked toward Wade's horse, Judge Harrison fell into step beside them. This isn't finished, you know, he said quietly. Webb's not the type to give up easily. I know, Wade replied. How much time do we have? Hard to say. If he goes to Santa Fe for a federal marshal, maybe 2 weeks. If he decides to take matters into his own hands, Harrison shrugged grimly. Could be tonight. Wade helped Lily onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The feel of her against him, solid and warm and real, sent something through his chest like electricity. For 3 weeks, he'd slept alone in his house, and only now did he realize how empty it had felt. Judge, Lily said, turning in the saddle to address Harrison, those irregularities Mrs. Martinez mentioned in Webb's paperwork, how serious are they? Harrison's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Serious enough to invalidate his claim if we can prove deliberate fraud. Mrs. Harrison's sister is very thorough in her record-keeping. The ride home passed in comfortable silence, Lily's weight against Wade's chest and the familiar rhythm of his horse's gait combining to create a sense of rightness he'd never expected to feel. The mountains stood sentinel around them, and the ranch buildings appeared in the distance like a promise of sanctuary. It wasn't until they were walking up to the front porch that Lily spoke again. Wade, there's something I need to tell you. He paused with his hand on the door, sensing the importance in her tone. What is it? When Webb took me, he showed me letters. From that cattle baron in Texas, he wants me to marry. She took a shaky breath. He's offering more than money. He's offering Webb a partnership in a scheme to buy up water rights across the territory. Wade felt cold understanding wash over him. That's why he won't give up. This isn't just about one debt anymore. No, Lily agreed. It's about control of half the good grazing land in New Mexico, and I'm the key to it all. Wade stared at his house, their house, and felt the weight of what they were facing settle on his shoulders like a mountain. This wasn't just about winning back his wife anymore. This was about stopping a land grab that could destroy dozens of honest ranchers. Then we'd better get ready, he said quietly, because Webb's going to come at us with everything he has. Lily reached into her sleeve and withdrew something Wade hadn't expected to see, a small quilt square, carefully embroidered with intertwining roses. It was delicate work, the kind that took hours of patient stitching, and he realized she must have been working on it during their weeks together. I started this for us, she said simply, for our home. I'd like to finish it, if we have time. Wade looked at the needlework, seeing not just fabric and thread, but hope stitched into every careful stitch. A shared quilt, made together, the kind of thing his parents might have created during their long winter evenings, building something beautiful, one piece at a time. We'll make time, he said, and meant it. Whatever came next, they would face it as husband and wife, partners in truth as well as name. Together, they walked into their home, ready to fight for the future they were only just beginning to imagine. 3 days of peace felt like a lifetime and an eye blink all at once. Wade and Lily fell into rhythms that felt both new and ancient, working side by side in the garden she'd started, sharing meals across the kitchen table, talking by lamplight about everything and nothing. In the evenings, Lily worked on her quilt, while Wade repaired tack or read week-old newspapers, the comfortable silence between them punctuated by her occasional questions about stitching patterns or his observations about territorial politics. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Miguel burst through the front door without knocking, his usual courtesy abandoned in favor of urgency. "Patron, you need to see this," he said, breathing hard from a fast ride. In his weathered hand, he held a letter bearing official territorial seals. Wade took the document, noting the tremor in Lily's hands as she set down her needlework. The paper felt heavy, weighted with official importance and bad news. "What is it?" Lily asked. Wade's eyes scanned the formal language, his expression growing darker with each line. "It's from the Territorial Governor's office, an arrest warrant." "For what?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Kidnapping," Wade said, his voice flat with disbelief. "It seems Marcus Webb has filed charges claiming I abducted you from his lawful custody." Lily stood so quickly her sewing basket tumbled to the floor, spilling threads and needles across the wooden planks. "That's impossible. I went with him willingly, and I left willingly. Doesn't matter what the truth is, if he's got a federal marshal convinced otherwise." Wade's jaw clenched as he continued reading. "Says here I'm to surrender myself for transport to Santa Fe within 24 hours. Miguel spat into the fireplace, his disgust evident. "And who delivered this warrant, Patron?" "Deputy Foster from Las Cruces." Wade folded the paper carefully, his movements controlled, despite the anger Wade could see building in his shoulders. "He's waiting in town for my response." Lily sank back into her chair, her face pale in the lamplight. "This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop!" Wade's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. "You didn't cause this. Webb did, when he decided to traffic in human lives." "But what do we do?" she asked. "If you run, you'll be fugitives. If you surrender—" "If I surrender, I'll sit in a Santa Fe jail while Webb has free rein to pursue his schemes." Wade began pacing, his mind working through options that all seemed to lead to bad endings. "By the time any trial concluded, assuming I got a fair one, he could have you married off to his Texas partner and half the territory's water rights in his pocket." Miguel cleared his throat. "There is another possibility, Patron." Both Wade and Lily looked at him expectantly. The foreman's dark eyes held a glint that suggested he'd been thinking about this problem longer than the few minutes since he'd arrived. "What if the warrant is not legitimate?" Miguel asked. Wade frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miguel said carefully, "that Deputy Foster is Webb's cousin, has been for 30 years, and I mean that Mrs. Harrison's sister, the one who works at the Territorial Registry, she has been asking questions about certain documents, official documents that perhaps were not filed through proper channels." Understanding began to dawn on Wade's face. "You're saying the warrant is forged?" "I am saying," Miguel replied, "that a man desperate enough to forge a promissory note might be desperate enough to forge other papers as well." Lily stood again, this time moving to the window, where she could see the lights of town flickering in the distance. "How could we prove it?" "By examining the original," Miguel said, "which would be filed with the territorial government in Santa Fe, and which Mrs. WWWW, Harrison's sister, says shows some very interesting discrepancies when compared to the copy Deputy Foster is carrying." Wade felt something shift in his chest, a dangerous mixture of hope and fury. "Webb's been playing a longer game than we realized." "See," Miguel agreed, "but perhaps not as clever a game as he believes." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Wade moved instinctively to the window, his hand dropping to his gun as he counted riders in the moonlight. 6 men, moving with the purposeful precision of a hunting party. "They're not waiting for morning," he said grimly. Lily moved to his side, her face set with determination rather than fear. "Then we don't wait either." Wade looked at her, seeing something in her expression that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this woman, who'd walked into his life with nothing but courage and stubbornness. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, reaching into her sewing basket for something that wasn't thread or fabric, "that it's time Webb learned what happens when he underestimates the people he's trying to cheat." She withdrew a letter, the paper thick and expensive, sealed with red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. Wade stared at it, confusion replacing his battle-ready tension. "What is that?" Lily's smile was sharp as winter starlight. The real reason Webb wants me married to his Texas partner. You see, my mother wasn't just any rancher's daughter. She was Eleanor Whitmore, heir to the largest cattle operation in South Texas. The words hit Wade like a physical blow. The Whitmore name was legendary across the Southwester family that had built an empire on beef and land and political connections stretching back to the Republic of Texas. When she married my father, she was disinherited for choosing love over obligation. Lily continued, but family fortunes have a way of changing. My grandfather died last month, and my uncle, who never married, never had children, has been looking for his sister's daughter. She held up the letter, and Wade could see his own stunned expression reflected in her eyes. This came 3 days before Webb took me. My uncle wants to meet me, to discuss my inheritance. Apparently, I'm now heir to more land and cattle than Webb and his partner could steal in a lifetime. Miguel whistled low under his breath. And Webb knows this? Webb knows everything that happens in 3 counties, Lily said. He's been watching the mail, intercepting letters, probably planning to use me as his key to the Whitmore fortune all along. The sound of horses was closer now, and Wade could hear voices calling his name. Deputy Foster's voice, demanding surrender under territorial authority that might not even exist. So what's the plan? Wade asked, checking his gun and grabbing extra ammunition from the shelf. Lily folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bodice. We go to Santa Fe, not as fugitives, but as citizens demanding justice. We expose Webb's forgeries, challenge his authority, and make sure everyone knows exactly who's been breaking the law. And if they don't listen? Lily's smile was pure steel wrapped in silk. Then we go to Texas, claim my inheritance, and come back with enough money and political influence to bury Marcus Webb so deep he'll never see sunlight again. Wade stared at his wife, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since she'd walked into his life. Not the desperate girl wagered in a poker game, not the frightened woman taken by force, but Eleanor Whitmore's daughter, heir to a cattle empire and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that built dynasties. You've been planning this, he said, and it wasn't a question. I've been hoping for it, she corrected, hoping that when the time came, I'd have a partner strong enough to stand with me against whatever we'd face. The riders were at the front gate now, and Foster's voice carried clearly across the night air. Wade Cutter, come out with your hands visible. You're under arrest by order of the territorial government. Wade looked at Lily, at Miguel, at the life he'd built with his own hands and stubbornness. Then he looked at the future, uncertain, dangerous, but suddenly filled with possibilities he'd never dared imagine. Back door, he asked Miguel. Horses saddled and waiting, Miguel confirmed. The Senora's trunk is already loaded with her things. Wade turned to Lily, seeing the woman he'd married and the woman she'd always been beneath the surface. Ready to find out what we're really made of? Lily picked up her sewing basket, but instead of quilting supplies, Wade now saw it held a small derringer, spare ammunition, and enough gold coins to fund a journey. She'd been preparing for this moment since the day Webb took her, planning their escape with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. I've been ready my whole life, she said simply. Together, they stepped into the night, leaving behind the safety of known troubles for the dangerous promise of unknown adventures. The game had changed, the stakes had risen, and for the first time since this all began, Wade felt like they might actually have a chance to win. The night ride to Santa Fe took 2 days through country that demanded respect and offered no mercy to the careless. Wade and Lily pushed hard through arroyos and mountain passes, following game trails and old Apache routes that Miguel had learned from his grandfather. Behind them, they could only hope that Foster and his men were still searching the ranch and immediate area, buying them precious time to reach the territorial capital. Wade's Colt 45 rode heavy on his hip, a familiar weight that had become both comfort and burden. The gun had been his father's before him, carried through cattle drives and range wars, used to put down injured horses and face down claim jumpers. Now it might be called upon for its gravest purpose, protecting the woman who rode beside him with a determination that both humbled and terrified him. Tell me about your mother, Wade said as they watered their horses at a hidden spring Miguel had shown him years ago. The real story, not what your father let people believe. Lily's hands stilled on her horse's bridle, her eyes focusing on something beyond the immediate landscape. She was 19 when she met my father at a cattle auction in San Antonio. The Whitmore Princess, they called her, educated in New Orleans and promised to the son of another ranching family. Wade settled beside her on a fallen log, giving their mounts time to rest while keeping watch on their back trail. No dust clouds yet, but that could change quickly. She told me once that the moment she saw Thomas Brennan, she knew her life was about to change completely. Lily continued. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, wasn't wealthy, wasn't connected to the right families, but he had dreams, and he talked about them like they were already real. What kind of dreams? A ranch in New Mexico territory, land where a man could build something lasting, where children could grow up free from the expectations and obligations that came with old money. Lily's voice carried a wistfulness that made Wade's chest tighten. She followed him here against her family's wishes, and for a while, those dreams seemed possible. What changed? Lily was quiet for so long that Wade thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think my father never quite believed he deserved her. And when you don't believe you deserve something good, you have a way of destroying it to prove yourself right. Wade understood. He'd seen it in other men, kind of self-doubt that turned into anger, anger that turned into recklessness, recklessness that destroyed everything it touched. Is that why he gambled? At first it was just small stakes, social games, nothing serious. But after my mother died, it became something else. A way to punish himself, maybe, or to finally lose everything so he wouldn't have to pretend he was worthy of what she'd given up for him. Wade reached over and covered her hand with his, feeling the fine tremor that she was trying so hard to hide. And you became the final thing he could lose. Yes. The word came out like a confession. Though I think part of him hoped you'd be different. Hoped that somehow I'd find with you what my parents had before it all went wrong. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Wade felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not just to protect Lily from Webb's schemes, but to prove worthy of the trust her dying mother had placed in a future she'd never see. We should move, Lily said, standing and checking her horse's girth. Santa Fe's still a full day's ride, and I want to reach the territorial offices before Webb realizes what we're doing. They rode through the afternoon heat and into the evening cool, the landscape gradually changing from high desert to the greener valleys that surrounded the capital. As the lights of Santa Fe appeared in the distance, Wade felt his nerves tighten like guitar strings. You sure about this plan? He asked as they approached the outskirts of town. Lily patted the leather portfolio she'd retrieved from her saddlebag's documents that Miguel's wife had helped her secure during their hasty escape. Mrs. Harrison's sister wasn't just helpful about Webb's forgeries. She also provided copies of legitimate territorial records that show exactly when and how certain warrants should be filed. And if we're wrong, if Foster's warrant is real, then we're fugitives either way, Lily said practically. But at least this way, we go down fighting for the truth instead of running from lies. They found lodging at a small inn near the plaza, registering under assumed names and paying cash for rooms on the second floor with a clear view of the street. Wade insisted on staying awake through the night, watching for any sign that they'd been followed or discovered. As dawn broke over the adobe buildings and ancient churches of Santa Fe, Lily sat at the small table in her room, carefully reviewing the documents that would either vindicate them or seal their fate. The inheritance letter from her uncle lay alongside territorial records, witness statements from townspeople who'd seen Webb's behavior at the church, and a detailed accounting of discrepancies in his legal filings. You don't have to do this, Wade said from his position by the window. We could keep riding. Mexico's only a few days south, and with your inheritance... No. Lily's voice was firm as steel. Running makes us guilty of something we didn't do. Besides, Webb won't stop with us. He'll find other ways to steal what he wants, hurt other people who can't fight back. Wade turned from the window to study her face, seeing the determination that reminded him of her mother's portrait, the one he'd found among her belongings, showing a young woman with the same stubborn chin and uncompromising eyes. "You're not doing this just for us," he realized. "I'm doing it because it's right," she said simply, "because my mother gave up everything to follow her conscience, and I won't dishonor that by taking the easy path when the hard one is what justice demands." At precisely 9 o'clock, they walked together into the territorial government building, their documents organized and their story rehearsed. The clerk who greeted them was a nervous young man who clearly recognized trouble when he saw it approaching his desk. "We need to speak with someone about fraudulent warrants and forged documents," Lily said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of breeding and education. "Someone with the power to arrest federal officers who've exceeded their authority." The clerk's eyes widened. I'll fetch the Territorial Attorney General. Please wait here." While they waited, Wade kept watch on the street through the tall windows, noting the unusual number of armed men who seemed to be loitering near the building. Webb's influence extended further than they'd hoped. "He knows we're here," Wade said quietly. Lily followed his gaze and saw what he'd seen, men positioned to watch every exit, hands resting casually on gun butts, eyes that never stopped moving. "Then we'd better make this count." The Territorial Attorney General, when he finally appeared, was a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his life indoors with law books. But his eyes were sharp, and he listened with growing interest as Lily presented their case with the precision of a trained lawyer. "These are serious accusations," he said finally, examining Webb's warrant against the territorial filing records. "If you're correct about these forgeries, it represents a fundamental breach of federal authority." "What can you do about it?" Wade asked. "I can order an immediate investigation. I can suspend any warrants that show signs of tampering or irregularity, and I can issue protective custody orders that would place Mrs. Cutter under territorial rather than federal jurisdiction while the matter is resolved." Lily leaned forward. "How long would that take?" "Days, possibly weeks, depending on what we find." The Attorney General set down the documents and fixed them both with a steady stare. "But I have to warn you, if Marcus Webb has the connections you suggest, this fight is far from over. Exposing his methods might only force him to try more direct approaches." Wade's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "You mean violence?" "I mean, a man who's willing to forge federal warrants is probably willing to do worse when those forgeries are exposed." The Attorney General stood, already reaching for his coat. "I suggest you both remain in protective custody until we can determine the full extent of Webb's activities." "No," Lily said immediately. "Protective custody means hiding. I'm done hiding from men who think they can buy and sell women like livestock." "Mrs. Cutter." "Mr. Attorney General," she interrupted, her voice carrying the full weight of her heritage. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore Cutter. My family has been fighting men like Marcus Webb since before this territory existed. I didn't come here to hide. I came here to finish this." The man's face went pale as the implications of her name registered. The Whitmore family didn't just have money, they had political connections reaching all the way to Washington, the kind of influence that could make or break territorial careers. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked carefully. Lily smiled, and Wade saw in that expression the woman who'd faced down Webb with nothing but a sewing needle and pure determination. "I'm proposing we give Mr. Webb exactly what he wants, final confrontation. But this time it'll be on our terms, with legal witnesses and with the full authority of territorial law behind us." Wade felt his pulse quicken as he realized what she was planning. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the kind of bold stroke that could end Webb's schemes forever. "When?" he asked. "Today," she said, "before he has time to adapt to the new situation, before he can buy more false documents or hire more guns. We end this now, while we still have the advantage of truth on our side." Wade looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened girl from the poker game, but the woman she'd always been underneath. Eleanor Whitmore's daughter, heir to a cattle empire, and possessed of the kind of courage that built nations. "All right," he said, his hand resting on the gun that might soon be called upon to defend everything they'd fought to build. "Let's finish this." The confrontation was set for high noon in the plaza outside the territorial courthouse, with all the formality of a legal proceeding and all the tension of a gunfight. Word had spread through Santa Fe like wildfire. The Whitmore heiress was challenging Marcus Webb's authority in open court, with territorial officials as witnesses and the press taking notes for papers across the Southwest. Wade stood beside Lily on the courthouse steps, acutely aware of the crowd gathering in the plaza below. Men in business suits mixed with ranchers and shopkeepers, all drawn by the promise of seeing justice done or blood spilled, depending on their particular interests. The Territorial Attorney General had arranged for a dozen armed deputies to maintain order, but Wade could see Webb's men scattered throughout the crowd, their hands never far from their weapons. Lily had chosen to wear her mother's dress for the occasions, simple but elegant creation in deep blue that spoke of quality without ostentation. More importantly, she wore her mother's courage like armor, standing straight-backed and clear-eyed as she faced the man who'd tried to reduce her to a commodity in his schemes. Webb arrived precisely on time, flanked by Deputy Foster and 6 hired guns who looked like they'd been recruited from the worst saloons between here and Mexico. The man himself was dressed in his finest suit, playing the role of legitimate businessman wronged by outlaws and thieves. But Wade could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted constantly to the crowd, as if measuring support and opposition. "Mrs. Cutter," Webb called out as he climbed the courthouse steps, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "I'm surprised to see you here voluntarily. I'd expected your husband to keep you hidden while he ran from legitimate authority." "Mr. Webb," Lily replied, her voice steady and strong, "I'm here to face your accusations directly, to let these witnesses hear the truth about your methods and your forged documents." Webb's face flushed with anger, but he maintained his composure. "Forged documents, that's a serious accusation, young lady. I hope you have proof to support such claims." The Territorial Attorney General stepped forward, a folder of official papers in his hand. "Mr. Webb, based on our investigation of your warrant, we've discovered significant irregularities. The filing dates don't match territorial records, the witness signatures show suspicious similarities, and most damaging of all, the federal marshal you claim issued this warrant denies any knowledge of it." The words hit the crowd like stones thrown into still water, ripples of murmur and conversation spreading outward. Webb's face went white, then red, as he realized his carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling in front of half the territory. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "I have proper authority." "You have forged papers and intimidation," Lily interrupted, stepping forward so her voice would carry to every corner of the plaza. "What you don't have is any legal right to claim me as property or to interfere in my marriage." It was then that Lily's courage truly showed itself. She reached into her sleeve and withdrew something that caught the morning light, not the sewing needle she'd threatened Webb with before, but something far more dangerous to his schemes. Her grandfather's seal ring, the one that gave her authority to speak for the Whitmore family interests. "Furthermore," she continued, slipping the ring onto her finger where it caught the sunlight like a beacon, "as heir to the Whitmore cattle empire, I'm officially withdrawing my family's business from any bank, ranch, or commercial enterprise that deals with Marcus Webb or his associates." The announcement sent a shock through the crowd. The Whitmore name carried weight across 3 states, and their business relationships could make or break smaller operations. Webb's face went ashen as he realized the full implications of what she'd just declared. "You can't," he began, but Lily cut him off. "I can, and I just did. The Whitmore family has been fighting men like you since before this territory existed, Mr. Webb. Men who think money and threats give them the right to own other human beings." Wade watched Webb's men shift restlessly, their hands moving closer to their guns. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and he could feel the potential for violence building like pressure before a storm. "This isn't over," Webb said, his voice low and dangerous. "Legal papers or not, you're coming with me." Today. No, Lily said simply. I'm not. Webb's hand moved toward his gun, and Wade saw the moment when civilized discourse gave way to frontier justice. The crowd began to scatter, women grabbing children and men reaching for weapons, as the plaza transformed from courthouse to battlefield in the space of a heartbeat. Lily, Wade said quietly, get behind me. She shook her head, standing her ground with the kind of determination that had built empires. We stand together, or we don't stand at all. Webb's gun cleared leather with practice speed, but he hadn't counted on the territorial deputies who'd been positioned specifically to prevent this moment. 3 rifles swung toward him simultaneously, their owners calling for him to drop his weapon. For a frozen moment, the plaza held its breath. Then Webb made his choice, and the morning exploded into violence that would be remembered in territorial history for decades to come. The first shot came from Deputy Foster, who'd been reaching for his gun even as the territorial deputies called for surrender. His bullet sparked off the courthouse steps, sending stone chips flying as Wade dove to shield Lily with his body. The plaza erupted into chaos as Webb's hired guns opened fire on the deputies, turning the morning into a thunder of gunshots and shouting voices. Wade's Colt was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw. 12 years of frontier life, making the motion as natural as breathing. He put 2 quick shots into the nearest gunman, dropping him before he could get a clean shot at the territorial attorney general. "Stay down!" Wade shouted to Lily, but when he glanced back, she was anything but cowering. Instead, she was moving with purposeful calm toward the courthouse entrance, using the stone pillars as cover, while motioning for civilians to follow her to safety. Webb himself had taken position behind a water trough, his gun spitting fire as he tried to work his way toward Lily. Wade could see the obsession in the man's eye, 7 with his schemes falling apart around him. Webb was still focused on claiming the prize that would make him rich beyond measure. "Cutter," Webb shouted over the gunfire. "This doesn't have to end badly for you. Give me the woman and ride away." Wade's answer was a bullet that sent splinters flying from the trough's wooden edge. "She's not property to be given, Webb. When are you going to understand that?" The territorial deputies were holding their own, their superior position on the courthouse steps giving them good fields of fire. But Webb's men were professionals, moving with the kind of tactical precision that spoke of military training. They were working systematically to surround the building, cutting off escape routes and forcing the defenders into an increasingly desperate position. It was then that Lily surprised everyone, including Wade. Instead of staying safely behind cover, she stood up in full view of the plaza and raised her voice to carry over the gunfire. "Marcus Webb," she called out, her tone cutting through the chaos like a church bell. "I challenge your claim publicly, before God and these witnesses." The shooting actually paused as men on both sides tried to process what they'd just heard. In the sudden quiet, Lily's voice rang out clear and strong. "By the laws of this territory and the rights granted to me by birth and marriage, I reject your authority and choose my own path. I choose Wade Cutter as my husband, freely and without coercion." Wade felt his heart catch in his throat. She was using the moment of confusion to make their marriage as public and official as any legal ceremony could ever be. But she was also making herself a target for every gun in the plaza. Webb's face twisted with rage and something that might have been madness. "You think your fancy words matter now? I'm taking what's mine." He broke from cover, charging toward the courthouse steps with his gun blazing. But he'd forgotten about the ring. Lily wore the Whitmore seal that represented more than just family wealth. It represented connections, loyalty, and the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or stolen. From the crowd came a voice that rang with authority. "Stand down, Webb, by order of the federal marshal." A new figure emerged from the scattered civilians, a tall man, with a badge that caught the morning light and the kind of presence that made armed men think twice about their choices. Behind him came 6 federal deputies, their weapons trained on Webb's remaining gunmen. Marshal Davidson, the territorial attorney general, called out in relief, "Thank God you're here." Webb spun toward the new threat, his face going white as he realized his forged warrant had just been contradicted by the real thing. "This is territorial business, Marshal. You have no authority." "I have a telegram from Washington, D.C., Davidson replied calmly, producing an official document. "Seems the Whitmore family has some influential friends who were concerned about reports of fraudulent federal warrants being used to kidnap their heiress." Wade saw the moment when Webb finally understood that his game was over. The man's shoulders sagged as the weight of complete defeat settled on him like a shroud. His hired guns were already dropping their weapons, smart enough to recognize when the odds had shifted beyond recovery. But Webb wasn't finished. With the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, he made one final play. Instead of surrendering, he lunged toward Lily, perhaps thinking he could use her as a shield or bargaining chip. He never made it. Wade's shot took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the courthouse steps. As Webb lay gasping in the morning sunlight, Wade holstered his gun and moved to Lily's side. "It's over," he said quietly, taking her hand and feeling the weight of her grandfather's ring against his palm. Lily looked down at Webb, her face showing not triumph, but the kind of sadness that came with seeing a life wasted on greed and cruelty. "Yes," she said, "it's over." From her other hand, she withdrew something small and golden, Wade's mother's wedding ring, the one he'd given her weeks ago in his kitchen when their marriage had been nothing more than an arrangement born of a poker game. "This belongs on my finger," she said, sliding it into place beside the Whitmore seal. "If you'll have me as your real wife, not just your legal one." Wade looked at the two-ring zone, representing the past he'd inherited, the other, the future they'd chosen together. Then he looked at Lily's face and saw everything he'd ever wanted without knowing he was looking for it. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll have you." As the federal marshal's men led away, the surviving gunmen and the crowd began to disperse. Wade Cutter kissed his wife for the first time, as a free man married to a free woman. The gamble had paid off in ways neither of them could have imagined. 6 months later, Wade stood in the same kitchen where this story had begun, but everything had changed. The morning light still painted the mountains gold. His coffee was still black as midnight, but the silence that had once defined his mornings was now filled with the sounds of a shared life. Lily humming softly as she kneaded bread, the rustle of her skirts as she moved between stove and table, the comfortable rhythm of two people who'd learned to build something together. The homestead deed hanging on the wall bore two names now, Wade Samuel Cutter and Eleanor Whitmore Cutter. The legal document had been redrawn by Judge Harrison himself, reflecting not just their marriage, but their equal partnership in everything they'd built and everything they planned to build. "The bread smells perfect," Wade said, looking up from the territorial newspaper that had made their story famous across 3 states. The headline still made him shake his head. "Whitmore heiress defeats land grab scheme in plaza gunfight." Lily smiled, her hands dusted with flour and her face glowing with the kind of contentment that came from work done well. "I finally got the measurements right. Took me months to understand what my mother meant about adjusting for the altitude. She wore both rings, Noah's mother's simple gold band, and her grandfather's self, 2 pieces of metal somehow complementing each other perfectly. The rings told the story of who they'd been separately and who they'd become together. "Miguel says the Whitmore cattle should arrive next week," Wade said, folding the newspaper carefully. "You sure about bringing them here instead of going to Texas?" Lily paused in her kneading, considering the question she'd been asked dozens of times by well-meaning relatives and business associates. The Whitmore Ranch in Texas was legendary, larger than some eastern states, profitable beyond imagination, and run by managers who could have made her wealthy without her ever lifting a finger. "I'm sure," she said simply. "My mother chose love over obligation, and so do I. Besides, this is where we built something real. Why would I want to leave that for something that already exists?" Wade felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever he was reminded of how close he'd come to losing her, even if it means smaller profits and harder work. Especially because of that, Lily shaped the dough into loaves with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to find joy in daily tasks. "My uncle understands," He's got nephews in Texas who can run the ranch there. What he needed was someone to carry on the family name and values, not necessarily someone to live in the family house. The new deed represented more than just shared ownership. It represented a choice they'd made together to build something that belonged to both of them equally. Not the Cutter Ranch where Lily happened to live, not the Whitmore Empire where Wade might feel like an outsider, but something entirely new that honored both their histories while creating their own legacy. "Speaking of family," Lily said, wiping her hands on her apron and moving to the window, "I think Miguel was right about the timing." Wade joined her at the window, following her gaze to where a small group of riders was approaching the ranch. Even at a distance, he could make out the familiar figure of Father Morales in the lead, followed by Judge Harrison, Sarah Martinez, and several other townspeople. The christening party, Wade realized, his hand moving instinctively to Lily's still flat stomach, where their first child was growing. "Our child will have a proper baptism," Lily said firmly, "and a proper family to welcome them into the world." Wade thought about the child they were expecting, conceived not from obligation or arrangement, but from love that had grown slowly and surely through shared work and quiet evenings. Their son or daughter would grow up knowing that love was something you chose every day, not something that happened to you like weather. "What do you think your mother would say about all this?" he asked. Lily was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly. "I think she'd say that some gambles are worth taking, especially when you're betting on love." The riders were closer now, and Wade could see that they'd brought gifts, flowers from Sarah's garden, a hand-carved cradle from the carpenter, bottles of wine that Judge Harrison had been saving for special occasions. The community that had stood with them against Webb was here to celebrate the future they'd built from the ashes of other people's schemes. "We should go greet them," Lily said, but she didn't move from the window immediately. Instead, she stood with Wade's arm around her waist, watching their friends approach across the land they'd fought to keep. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd folded that night?" she asked. "If you'd just walked away from the poker table?" Wade considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, solitary, careful, content with a life that asked little and offered less. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember that the best gambles aren't the ones where you know you'll win. They're the ones where you risk everything for something that might be worth everything." Lily turned in his arms, her brown eyes holding all the warmth and determination that had first drawn him to her. "And was it worth everything?" Wade looked at his wife, really looked at her, seeing the girl who'd been wagered in a poker game, and the woman who'd stood up to an entire conspiracy, the frightened bride who'd arrived at his door, and the partner who'd helped him build something bigger than either of them could have created alone. "Ask me in 50 years, he said, kissing her forehead gently, "when we've had time to see what we've really built here." But even as he said it, Wade knew the answer. Some gambles paid off in ways you could never predict, creating possibilities you'd never imagined. Their marriage had started with a hand of cards, but it would be measured in years of shared mornings, children raised together, and the quiet satisfaction of work done side by side. As they walked out to greet their friends, Wade realized that he'd finally learned the difference between luck and choice. Luck had brought Lily to his door, choice had made her his wife. And love, real, chosen, earned love, would make them a family. The gamble was over. The real life was just beginning.